completed, Christ would have come ere this to receive his people to their reward. As we think about the fact that the second advent hasn't happened, it may be helpful us to remember the words of Jesus in Matthew 24. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. But as we think about that, we should ask ourselves, is Jesus talking causally? That is, will the preaching of the gospel to the whole world cause the end, the second advent, to occur? Or is it just a matter of chronology, and we're guilty of what philosophers call the fallacy of post-hoc? That is, after this, therefore because of this. Post hoc ergo propter hoc in Latin. Does the fact that every day the rooster crows and then the sun rises, does that mean that the crowing rooster makes the sun rise? Well, obviously not. But we need to come to terms with the delay. We have noted one explanation, that the church simply hasn't lived up to its possibilities. Another one is that the church has not been sufficiently spiritually matured. You'll remember this: when the character of Christ shall be perfectly reproduced in his people, then he will come to claim them as his own. Once again, we have the question of causality or chronology. Does the perfection, whatever that means, of God's people, whoever they are, does that precipitate the second advent, or is there more going on? Another suggestion is that what is holding up the second advent is the fact that the onlooking universe, that's a traditional Adventist idea, the onlooking universe hasn't yet got it, and that's what's holding up the second advent. Besides these explanations of delay, there are some explanations of what soon means. Is this a matter of just one's lifetime? I think it was James Landis who several years ago proposed that the second advent is no longer than our lifetime, no longer away than our lifetime, because when our lifetime is over, in an important sense, time is no more for us. So maybe that's what's being talked about by soon. Or is it the unexpectedness? We must confront the question, are these explanations adequate? What does it mean to say Jesus is coming soon? Do we have an explanation for this question, an answer to this question? Or are we doomed, if that's the right word, to experience a second great disappointment? Or is to be Adventist to be in a continuing disappointment? By the way, if you haven't read, try to get a hold of, perhaps through an Adventist website, Hiram Edson's recollection of October 22 and 23, 1844. You may, if you've read that, you may recall the poignant line, "We wept and wept till the day dawned." That was after midnight on October 22, when they realized that the second advent hadn't happened and they had been wrong. Their central belief had been falsified, and that was terrible. But then he recalls how a group of them went out to the barn to pray, and then you remember perhaps the trek through the cornfield at the vision of Christ entering the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary, and so on. I think, for what it's worth, that we should stop celebrating October 22 and replace it with a celebration of October 23. Well, that was the day that the Adventist community pulled up its socks and kept on going. It wasn't the end. They survived the great disappointment. And I think the survival is more important than the disappointment. And there is something about that survival that is a wonderful characteristic of Adventist Christianity. Of course, the first century Christians had to deal with the same problem. That is, Paul talked about those of us, we who are alive and remain. Well, all of the people who were alive died, and Jesus had not come. They lived with it, and so can we. Quickly, I am wondering if we have misunderstood some of what it means to be Adventist. Is our emphasis on imminence, which certainly Ellen White shared, is that really appropriate? Roy Branson, in whose honor this group meets every Sabbath, used to say, we are Adventist, not Millerite. That may be an important distinction. In 1844, October 23, the recognition was that they had misunderstood the nature of the event that was to happen. Is there something analogous, more or less, to that we ought to take seriously now? The heart of Adventist Christianity is the blessed hope. You know the phrase from Titus 2, we wait for the blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. 100 years ago, and more recently, it was often, not always certainly, but often the case that Adventists would sign their letters to each other, yours in the blessed hope. Maybe we would do well to think of the blessed hope. Be sure to read John Brunt's chapter on hope in the book that I hope you will be reading. Hope is knowing and not knowing, but different things. It's knowing the character of God, but not knowing the timing, or even all of the factors related to the timing. Some characteristics of hope: eagerness for humanness to get going. We ought to think of the Second Advent not as the end of the world, but as the beginning of a brand new kind of existence. At the same time that hope is eager for its fulfillment, it is willing to wait. It is aware of transcendence, and that in the presence of transcendence, there are a lot of things we don't understand. One of our problems is that we think we know more than we in fact know, and we need to get beyond that. Hope is also a matter of assurance, the knowledge that makes the hope reasonable, and that knowledge is not knowledge of last day events, it's knowledge of the character of God. That's what we can be sure about. Our scenarios for last day events have been quite consistent. They've all been wrong. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't have those scenarios. It just means that we should be modest as we predict the future. Okay, we've got a few minutes, not very many, but a few minutes for questions and comments. And with that, I will take my throne-like chair over here and sit down. One of the facts of life about advancing age that is that not all of the bones and joints work as well as they used to. Some of you may have experienced some of that. Anyway, please.
Fritz, I presume that you got the same email that I did from Ron Graybill.
Yes.
And he recapitulates across the 77 years of Ellen White's ministry that every year she predicted that the end was now. And she got her information from either angels, Jesus, or the Holy Spirit. And she was very emphatic about it. There was no doubt about her conviction.
Oh, absolutely.
And then, so if you read that whole, I read them all from start to finish. If you read them all and try to put them together in an analytical way, each year that she expresses this, it loses its currency. So by the time we get to our age, there's not as much value as the time when they were issued on each occasion of those years in her life ministry. So that we've lost a lot of the zip out of the message, so to speak.
Yes, and the question is, or the question that comes to me from that litany of expressions, and that of course even Graybill, by the way, Ron Graybill sent this from Denmark, where he's on vacation with his wife's family. I think a way, not the way, but a way to understand that is that we see Ellen White gradually moving from what Roy Branson called Millerite thinking to Adventist thinking. And I would offer as a tentative explanation, note the word tentative, that Millerite thinking was obsessed with prediction and with imminence, whereas Adventist thinking is characterized by a more modest kind of prediction and an emphasis on hope. And I think, after all, Ellen grew up Millerite, and one doesn't lose that conditioning overnight. But I think as time went on, her own sense of imminence seems to have receded, as you have observed. And that's about all I can say. And even though she sometimes quotes the angel, said the angel, some food for worms, some living until the Lord comes, she is reporting her own understanding of that message. The angel, the angelic message gets to us through Ellen's mind and personality, heart, culture, etc. Now, that's the way I would go about understanding that development. But I agree that there is that, and also as I looked over that series, there is increasingly more emphasis on hope and salvation and less emphasis on judgment as the meaning of the end. Now, and I'm not sure whose hand was first, but I'll take this gentleman.
Just a comment on the obvious. Every day that goes by brings us closer to the second Advent.
Yes, but and that's certainly correct. It would be hard to refute or dispute that observation, but it doesn't really resolve, it seems to me, the question of what are we waiting for? And the way I sometimes phrase it, how long can we say Jesus is coming soon and still believe it ourselves? I mean, it's been, 172 years. What does soon mean after 172 years?
Well, the problem is if we're needing that to galvanize us into a change of behavior or change it. So that to me would be the fundamental fallacy of this and why it's losing its effect if we needed that imminence to get down to
Yes, and again, if you look at that series from Ron Graybill, and I'm not sure how many of us got that email yesterday, particularly in the earlier periods, there was an emphasis on the Second Advent as a motivation for proper behavior. And much of the time it was motivation for us to, do I dare say, get off our collective duff and get going, witness, serve, be the kind of people we ought to be, because Jesus is coming, and we don't have a lot of time left. That seems to be the logic. Now,
there's another interesting LOI comment, which to me is related, is something to the effect, if the Holy Spirit was impressed upon you 100 times greater, when it wouldn't make a difference. It's really how you respond, and it's not about God forcing the issue on us.
yes, it's not about God shouting louder, as it were. Now, another question or comment.
I'm about to ask a question, and I'm wearing rubber sole shoes, just to say. The delay for me calls into the question God's character. It hasn't just been 172 years. It's been since Jesus uttered the words. So it's been a millennium, several.
Couple of thousand years.
Thousands of years. Thousands of years of blood, suffering, torture, just, mind-boggling evil. And it continues to go. It hasn't stopped. So I begin to wonder, we keep saying God is love. God is love. If I allowed my children, and I could stop, and I allowed them to continue through this garbage in this sewer that life can be for some, if you live in Syria, for example. If I did that to my children, I would be immoral. I would be probably locked up.
You'd go to jail.
I'd go to jail. I'd be a psychopath. It's almost contrary to me. God is love, but God allows all this suffering. I know a theodicy. I've read Rice's book. I know all our attempts to spin that reality into something acceptable. But I'm beginning to wonder, is God really love? If he allows us to continue his children to be slaughtered like they are, have we got it wrong? Our religion is a hand-me-down religion. All of us Christians are hand-me-down Christians. We believe in what Augustine told us, and then what Calvin told us, and then what Ellen told us, and so on and so forth. So I'm beginning to question the progression, the evolution of our understanding. Maybe we have it wrong. Maybe there's something else. I'm just beginning to get very frustrated with this God of love and this endurance of suffering.
My response to that will not be satisfying, because I am convinced that the problem of evil has not been satisfactorily solved. We still live with the problem of evil. I think the best we can do is to accept the fact that there is an explanation, perhaps a transcendent explanation, that is one that is beyond our comprehension, and that the evidence that God is love for me is enough to, and this comes by the way, in part from relating to people who are seriously Christian, relating to the picture of Jesus in the Gospels. I think that is sufficient ground to make faith reasonable. Now, it doesn't answer the question of theodicy or the problem of evil. It doesn't solve that problem. I think that's something we, as of now at least, have to live with. But the alternative to believing that God is love, I think, is far worse. Now, that's a value judgment. Not everybody makes the same conclusion to which I have come. Now, by the way, I have tunnel vision, and
we're going to have to stop right now formally. And it seems unfortunate to me that we have to do that because the conversation has taken a very serious and I think helpful turn. So I'm going to invite those who have to leave to do so, and to do so as discreetly as you can, and then we'll continue the conversation as soon as things settle down. Okay? Nobody's leaving, so let's continue with the questions and comments.
We do have some people that are a little low.
Okay, Dr. Lamberton has the next question or comment.
I'm not going to begin to try to address some of the questions, but a friend who has pretty much given up on all the last day events and a lot of everything that went through that, said to me recently, what isn't hard to believe is that the kind of scenario that Ellen White talked about could happen with the loss of freedoms in exchange for security, wars, people, all that kind of social chaos. And I think it would be significant to see what happens to belief and hope, and if things disintegrate.
Yes. Now,
I'm sorry, Fritz, could you repeat the questions? Because not everybody can hear them, okay? At least repeat the questions as you heard them, and that's all that matters.
Well, let me ask for a repetition from the questioner, and we'll get it closer to the truth.
Well, it doesn't seem hard to imagine with recent events politically and militarily and socially that the kind of social chaos and anarchy and breakdown of government and the exchange of loss of freedom in exchange for security could happen. It looks a lot more realistic now than it maybe did when I was 20.
Yes, the situation is different. Was it the 1870s when there was, in fact, introduced into the United States Congress a Sunday law, Sunday closing law? Well, you simply cannot imagine all of the big box stores, Walmart, Costco, et cetera, closing on Sunday. That just is not believable now. But it is not 1870 anymore. It's 2016. And so all of the scenarios that made sense then, by the way, wasn't it John Butler who wrote an article some time ago, the world of Ellen White and the end of the world in Spectrum? That was, I think, a very perceptive recognition of the fact that we don't live in that world anymore. And scenarios that were entirely realistic and sensible then simply don't make sense, hence don't apply, and I think shouldn't worry us at this point. God always speaks in ways that we can understand. One way I like to put it is, if God is going to talk to the Chinese, God has the option of Cantonese or Mandarin. You know, English, French, Swahili won't work. God is limited to what people can understand. And language includes more than words and grammar. Language includes ideas, conceptualization, And all of that is a conditioning factor in what God says to us. God can only tell us what we can understand. Every teacher knows this.
I don't think so much about the whole scenario of Sunday and so on. Just the dialogue that took place between Sean Hannity and Newt Gingrich on we're at war. We have to start. We need to start infiltrating mosques. We have to, I could go on, but and half the population listens to this, and if things get that's what I think the person was saying. What I find not far fetched that the loss of liberty could happen.
Yes, that can happen. It's happened before, and so there is a sense. Notice the qualification there. There is a sense in which the scenario about the National Sunday Law is relevant. It just is that the public doesn't take Sunday that seriously anymore, and it is not conceivable. It doesn't mean impossible, but it's not conceivable that it would. Now, the lady in the red, no, it's orange, I guess. Sorry.
Thank you. The comment from there reminded me of the people who were living in Germany under 12 years of Hitler's complete terror. And it's very easy to be discouraged, but something kept them going. Something has kept a blessed hope of righteousness even to this day among all persecutions. And I think when you say the alternative is worse, I think even in spite of that, it's the Muslims. I grew up in an Islamic culture, and there is blessed hope for righteousness. So when radical Islam acts like that, you have to look back and say, okay, what else is there that I can believe in? Because not every Muslim is radical. And so what do? You give in to the bullies. What has kept people alive, I think, is that blessed hope in every culture.
Yes, let me reflect on what you have said, which says to me, however problematic the blessed hope may be, it sure beats hopelessness as a way to live, as a context for one's existence in a continually puzzling world. Yes, please.
You used a word in talking about October 22nd, 23rd, 1844. Their central belief or what have you, or value, had been falsified, which is a word often used in the context of science and philosophy of science and that kind of thing. And you also talked about the conservative tendency for things of ultimate importance, not shifting those lightly, abandoning those lightly, that kind of thing. And it seems to me that maybe liberal theology and liberal religious belief is in fact a kind of a conservative project in oftentimes in trying to hang on to the things of value and in spite of problems that have been arrived at. And so I'm wondering, say, as you would talk to students and others as they're sorting things out, to what extent should religion and Adventist Christianity be thought of like a scientific hypothesis that when you find these to be false, you abandon it, and move on to something more productive, versus you know, maybe not such a belief-oriented thing that you evolve and you grow. That's kind of a question, if it makes sense.
Well, I'm a little puzzled by your last disjunction.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the scientist who rejects an hypothesis doesn't give up being the scientist. And he probably doesn't even give up being the particular kind of scientist that he is. He just says, well, there is something that I used to believe, but I have come to understand that that belief isn't really the best I can do. I need to, you know, and even Isaac Newton, whose cosmology we have largely rejected, we don't think of Isaac Newton as a numbskull, as an idiot, as stupid. He was doing the best he could with what he had, and it was pretty creative and pretty helpful. But we've moved on, we understand more now, but we are no less scientific, or maybe in philosophy of science, we're no less philosophical, simply because we no longer have a Newtonian worldview. I think similarly, even though my kind of Adventist Christianity is not identical with Ellen White's, I risk putting it that way, but I think that's the simple fact, because I don't live in the 19th century as she did, and I didn't go through the Great Disappointment and so on. That doesn't mean I stopped being a believer. I don't stop being an Adventist Christian just because my Adventist Christianity is different, inevitably different from what the Adventist Christianity of the mid-19th century was. So I am in this sense loyal to the tradition and loyal to Ellen's own understanding that advancing in our understanding of truth and of Scripture would continue to the end. Well, obviously we're not at the end yet, so we still are in the process, on the way, in via. Philosophers who like to talk Latin would say we're on the way. And I think that is really exciting, because my security is based on the fact of God's character, God's love, as revealed in Jesus of Nazareth. It's not based on my past or present conviction. I suspect my grandchildren, I have one great-granddaughter, they will say, well, Gramps was considered a, kind of far-out left-wing Adventist, but there was a lot of stuff he just didn't get. Well, fine, wonderful. Isn't it great to be part of a community in motion, on the way to a future that includes better understanding than we have now? Though I am not convinced we will ever solve the problem of evil. Why did God make a creation? Why did God create a world in which moral beings could spit in God's eye, as clearly we have done? I don't know. I simply trust that God, being far wiser than I am, had good reason to create a world that we could mess up. By the way, if you read Genesis 6, you wonder a little bit, because there we have a kind of divine soliloquy in which God says, boy, this has turned out a lot worse than I anticipated. I'm not sure this was a good idea. I'm going to wipe them out and start over. And then at the end of the flood story, God seems to be saying, I'm not sure that wiping everything out was a good idea after all. I'm not going to do that again. Does God learn from experience? Maybe so. Evidently so. Ma'am.
I just want to say I appreciate so much your efforts to talk to us about what it means for Jesus to come soon. It seems to me that in one place in the New Testament, Jesus told a bunch of people that nobody knows the day of my coming, not even the angels, only my Father. So I don't know whether angels speak of their own opinions or what, but the angel could, the fact that the angel told Ellen White something doesn't necessarily mean, does it?
Maybe the angel was speaking out of angelic ignorance.
The other thing I've wondered is if we ought to sometimes translate that as quickly. Because once Jesus starts from heaven, it's going to happen.
Okay, what is it, the final events will be rapid ones,
Yes,
that
yes.
sort of idea? Yes, that's another one which I should have included. Maybe soon means unexpected. Maybe it's going to happen quickly. There won't be a lot of preliminary stuff that you can look at and say it's happening. Maybe it will be sudden. Maybe that's what soon is intended to convey. Notice the maybe in several of my sentences there. We will see how it works out. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say about the Sunday law. I think one of the main fears about the Sunday law when it was proposed was that it would do terrible damage to people trying to make a living and working on Sunday. But this bill that the religious liberty people have wanted us to comment on, Senate Bill 1146, I think, that was being debated in the Judicial Committee. I tried to be a good girl and send in my disagreement. I'm not sure of my facts exactly, but I believe it basically is an effort by the state of California to make sure that there's no discrimination, even in religious schools, against the LGBT community or transgender people, well, any of them. So I think what it says is that any school that somehow discriminates against them, their students cannot get government loans. And so I'm sure some of you did that. I got on Mike Morell's mailing list, and he said, he was very concerned about this. It's going to really hurt religious institutions if it goes through. It's well meant, but this world that we live in, it's going to come under this guise of doing good, just like it did in 1870, but a completely different culture is producing this. But I do think that it's going to happen.
Well, it will be interesting to see how that unfolds. Some of you will remember the Mary Kay case in which our church argued that it has a right to discriminate against women because it's somehow a religious belief, and the courts have responded that as long as you're engaged in interstate commerce, you do not have a right to discriminate against women, and that judgment cost the General Conference something in excess of $1 million to be paid to women, employees of the Pacific Press or something. I forget. I was talking before we began a formal conversation. One of the facts of life about advancing age is that their short-term memory, even your long-term memory, tends to deteriorate, and you don't know what you used to know. Please, in the back.
I had a thought as follow-up to the gentleman's comment about theodicy, and it's extremely heterodox and purely hypothetical, Lord. Please don't strike me down with the thunderbolt. I'll start with a brief metaphor. There was a cartoon, I think, may have been in the New Yorker a couple of years ago, a conference of scientists dealing with climate change and how to respond. And there was a slide up there saying, new jobs, green technology, cleaner air, all the benefits of adapting to climate change. Somebody in the audience raises their hand and says, but what if it's all a hoax? The implication being, this is a positive thing, even if we don't all agree on the sources and origins. What if, again, purely hypothetical, what if we're projecting facets and features of God's character, such as immortality? What if God is not immortal? What if he, as the theologians questioned in the 60s, and it was presented here sometime back to the Time magazine cover, is God dead? What if God is extremely ill, or it ages, or whatever? What if he knew that, didn't dare tell us, but he gave us a handbook for how to live? Love one another, be kind, help one another, help those who are weaker and less fortunate than you, turn the other cheek. And if all of humanity, and then Jesus exemplified all these in his personal life and character, and then said, go and tell the world my message and to be like me. And if the whole world became Christ-like and observed those things, we wouldn't have the Holocaust, we wouldn't have war, we wouldn't have evil, we wouldn't have death and destruction. God gave us the handbook for living. What if he is immortal? What if he is immortal? What if he has a plan and he's showing the other worlds? Maybe they're slow to learn. Maybe he's coming next week, next month, next year. What if he's not coming? Does it matter? He's told us how to live. He's told us how to live. All the rest is speculation, whether we're arguing about the origins or eschatology. He's told us how to live. We can agree on that.
You can tell I'm really old, because old people tend to quote themselves. Earlier on, I mentioned that I think growing up Adventist, being Adventist, has enormous practical value. You all know about the so-called Adventist advantage. You know, if you're a male, you're likely to live 7 years longer than if you weren't Adventist.
And that's with half of Adventists not following the health principles. Imagine what it would be if
we all did. And if you're female, the advantage is like 9 years. Now, why the difference between male and female, I'll let you medical people figure out. But I think there is so much practical value in being Adventist that I am more enthusiastically Adventist now than I have ever been, even though a lifetime of wallowing, I guess that's the right verb, in theology and in Adventist theology has led to a lot of questions for which I don't have answers. I still think being Adventist is the coolest thing going, and I'd rather be Adventist than any alternative of which I'm aware. And I'd certainly rather be Christian than atheist, even though, yes, there are problems. Why did a God of love create beings who could spit in his eye? I don't know. Would a little less freedom have been that bad? How would I know? I just know that we live in the world we live in, and I think living as an Adventist Christian is as good an option of which I'm aware. Now, I don't know all the options. As I said, I've grown up Adventist. I've grown up in mostly Southern California Adventist Christianity, which is different from South Carolina or South African Adventism, but I still think it's a really good thing, and every day I am grateful. Now, I think you